Welcome to the February 2021 meeting of the Northern New Mexico chapter of New Mexico Presswomen. Our topic today, a conversation about cannabis with Duke Rodriguez, President and CEO of Ultra Health. I'm Kathleen McCleery, and we're coming to you via Zoom once again, and I hope you're all staying safe and well during this pandemic. But before we begin, I want to share the screen and set the table with a little bit of background about cannabis use and legislation here in New Mexico and around the United States. And the fact is that states treat this issue differently. So in 15 states, those are the ones in black on your screen, cannabis is fully legal for medicinal and adult recreational use. In the 35 states in any shade of green, either the drug has been decriminalized or medical use is possible, or both. And in the 6 states, which you see in kind of light gray, cannabis is not legal at all. So let's turn to New Mexico, where medical use was signed into law by Governor Bill Richardson in 2007. And now there are more than 107,000 New Mexicans who have cards for prescriptions that can be filled at 122 dispensaries at a cost of about $10 a gram. It's a $200 million industry here in the land of enchantment. The debate over adult recreational use has been going on for decades. Governor Gary Johnson pitched the idea back in 1999, and 20 years later, the legislature decriminalized use of the drug, resulting in fines as low as $25 in some cities. Nearly 3/4 of New Mexicans back legalization of adult recreational use. And so then that brings us to 2021 and the current session at the Roundhouse. As of February 22nd, 5 bills had been filed. One has emerged from a House committee, another one's been tabled, and we're waiting to see action in the Senate. They differ on production caps, allowing home gardens, and how much an individual could possess, but they do have some common elements. They take away jurisdiction from the Department of Health and establish a new authority. They create a new tax. And most observers do think that legalization will happen sometime this year. Ultra Health has 22 dispensaries. It's the largest cannabis operator in the state. They grow the cannabis, they manufacture the medications, and they sell them. And sales were nearly $40 million last year, and that's a 100% increase over 2019. Heading up Ultra Health, Duke Rodriguez. He founded the company in 2010. Before that, he had high-ranking positions at Loveless, and he was a cabinet secretary in the Gary Johnson administration, where he helped to initiate reforms in welfare and Medicaid programs. And so I will stop the share and say, welcome, Duke Rodriguez. We're happy to have you.
Good morning, thank you.
So I'd like to start with the terminology. And you say cannabis, a lot of people say marijuana. Is one of them correct, one of them wrong?
I think it's important to note that cannabis is a technical term, and cannabis does define the plant. The genus is cannabis. Marijuana, we clearly try to avoid saying marijuana because honestly, it's rooted in racism. It has a long history that would probably take most of this morning to talk about, but basically, you'll hear the opponent say marijuana. It's sometimes to frighten people to give it its Hispanic and Mexican roots, but it generally isn't the right word to use.
Okay, so we'll say cannabis today.
Thank you.
Tell me about the debate. Is this a debate over the right to use cannabis, or is it about money? Is this a tool for an economic comeback?
I think it's all of the above. There are issues of social equity. There are clearly economic issues. There are issues of opportunity. The number of jobs it can create for New Mexico, the amount of tax revenue it can create, the amount of commerce it can create. But it's also acknowledging that the war on drug has been a failure and that there's a better way to treat cannabis in New Mexico. And probably the best way is to legalize it and regulate it.
So let's break down a couple of the things you mentioned. Let's talk some of the dollars first. The backers of legalization have said that cannabis could be the number 2 revenue source for our poor state after oil and gas. perhaps as much as $100 million a year. Opponents say those kinds of projections are just completely unrealistic. Where do you come down here?
I don't think it's very hard to show evidence that it's a big number. It's a big opportunity. And probably the best evidence we have is Colorado. Colorado just finished year 2020, and it might surprise most of your listeners to understand that in 2020, Colorado sold both medical and adult use of $2.2 billion. So it doesn't take much math to then figure out what is the population of New Mexico to Colorado, do an extrapolation, and you will easily get to a conservative value of anywhere from sales of 600 to as high as 800, and I've seen his estimates as high as 1 billion. When you start to kind of look at those revenue numbers of sales, you start looking at what tax rate to apply. Most folks have agreed that the tax rate should be around 15 to 20%. So let's do simple math. Say we get $600 million in sales, you get a 20% tax rate. Right there, you've computed about $120 million of new tax revenue and about a $600 million economic juggernaut for New Mexico.
So a 15% tax, I'm curious to know, or 20%, whatever it is, I'm curious to know whether is that just a tax on adult recreational use, or is that also a tax on medical use? And would those drugs have the same price tag as well?
I think most folks in the debate have recognized we probably should not be taxing medical. If in fact the law states that it's a medical use, then we should treat it equivalent to, say, prescription drugs, where there is no gross receipts tax or any kind of sales tax or excise tax. So I think all proposals are recognizing there shall be no tax on medical cannabis. And the tax that's being proposed is a combined cannabis excise tax, a local tax, and a gross receipts tax to a combined rate of somewhere we said 15 to 20%, but it'll all be on just the adult sales.
And if you're comparing that to other things, like, for example, alcohol or cigarettes, I mean, because otherwise 15 to 20% sounds like a huge number, right?
It's a very big number. And I think it's a little bit higher than what we see on tobacco, probably higher than on alcohol. I'm not sure the exact numbers, but it's probably going to generate more than the tobacco and alcohol taxes generate today.
So then turn to jobs. You mentioned jobs. How many jobs are we talking about, whether it's at Ultra Health or statewide?
That number tends to surprise people and hasn't gotten all the attention, but I think that's where the tremendous opportunity is. Again, if you look to our neighbors to the north, where they've got a robust model, they went to adult use in 2014, and they've grown the program very quickly. By 2015, they broke $1 billion, and in 2020, they broke $2 billion. But you look at their job component, there are 45,000 active card holders in that state who are employed in the cannabis industry, actually directly engaged in the production, the cultivation, the retail, actually involved directly in cultivation sales. Do the same kind of relationship. I think the economists have done it, legislative council have done it, and I think we're all agreeing that it's going to be about 11 to as much as 15,000 new jobs across the entire state.
So the tax money, and how much of this is really, when we talk about the money, how much of it is going to come back to New Mexico? Because a lot of companies have headquarters elsewhere. Even Ultra Health has a corporate office in Scottsdale. How do we make sure that this ends up in New Mexico?
Well, first of all the jobs, all the commerce will be conducted within the state boundaries. So you're convinced that all the wages will go directly into New Mexico. When I talk about 11 to 15,000 jobs, we're saying 11 to 15,000 jobs within the boundaries of New Mexico itself. The wages will be there, the investment in buildings and in land and in water and power, all the packaging, all the distribution will occur within the intrastate, within the state of New Mexico. You know, certainly someday they may take down the boundaries between states and you'll see sales cross state lines, and I think the opportunity becomes even bigger. But you can be assured that 800 million, 900 million, whatever that number is, all that commerce will happen within the bounds of New Mexico.
So aren't there going to be those significant costs for the state, whether it's for oversight, enforcement, setting standards for potency, creating warning labels, licensing the dispensaries, and even limiting purchases, because there are some people that we don't want to have the ability to purchase cannabis, right?
Kathleen, that is correct. While there's a big revenue opportunity, while there's a big economic opportunity, while it's broad-based across the entire state, there will be infrastructure. There'll be regulatory enforcement. There'll be regulation. There'll be state agencies involved. Most likely, it'll be RLD or regulation and licensing. But there'll be license fees. There'll be license fees on the retailers. There'll be fees on the producers, the cultivators. The license fees alone on just the cultivation will probably 5 to 6 million. There'll be enough fees to support the regulatory aspect while still generating a huge surplus in revenues.
I want to turn to some of the other criticisms that we've heard, because the criticism has come from the Greater Albuquerque Chamber of Commerce, from the Catholic Church, from some individual sheriffs around the state who have said that this could cause problems on roadways with vehicular accidents, workplace issues, and possible increases in crime. So I'm wondering if you could respond to some of that. How do you feel about that?
I think the complaints and the fears and the concerns should be addressed. I think when you really look at the reality, there's probably enough evidence to indicate they're probably not as well founded as one might guess. Look at the 15 states that have legalized: Oregon, Washington, California, Colorado. And there's always this initial fear that it's going to change the world as we know it today. Will employers still have the right to keep a drug-free workplace? The answer is yes. Will you be able to still arrest and restrict impaired drivers? The answer is yes. Will we have safeties in place to not to sell to those under the age of 21? Will we encourage education in the schools? The answer again is yes. We still will have the same risk. Keep in mind, we tend to forget that the consumption of what I call marijuana is going on today in an unregulated market. The promise and the hope in a regulated and taxed market where we consume cannabis legally and we understand where it's purchased, how much is purchased, and who can buy, you actually have a better opportunity than we have today. I think you'll see less impairment. I think you'll see greater enforcement within the workplace. I think law enforcement's activities will be redirected to matters that really are more sensitive to our population than minor offenses with the consumption of cannabis or marijuana.
It's a big job, but you made some really interesting points about how this is, and it has been done with other products. This is not the first time. Some of our members asked questions that have to do with the legislation. So I'm curious. One wanted to know if people could grow their own plants, and some of the bills do allow that. Wouldn't that cut into Ultra Health and other companies' markets?
Um, I don't want to make light of home grows. I think home grows play an important part. There's a certain segment in rural areas, even maybe in urban areas, where individuals can't afford the medicine or buying commercial cannabis. So the opportunity for those to grow their own should be out there. I know it might surprise some of my competitors to suggest that it's a good idea, but we again have seen in other states. In Colorado, they allow a home grow. In Arizona, they allow a home grow. In Oklahoma, they allow a home grow. Home grows are not the threat, the boogeyman that everyone would like to believe. I think they play a vital role in discovery. We begin to see how these plants perform in Farmington, in Aztec, in Hobbs, in Lovington, Portales, throughout the state. Home grows afford us a new opportunity for individuals to begin to experience what I would call, and it may surprise people, but the magic of what cannabis could be. So I think home grows are the early seeds, the early seedlings of this industry growing much, much larger. And maybe today's home grow might be tomorrow's micro business and eventually a large commercial grower. So I think it provides an avenue introduction into the industry.
So if those people grow their own, would they have the ability to give it away, trade with other friends, or even sell small amounts? How do you regulate that?
We're leaving some of that undefined and allowing the regulator to create a framework as to how they can participate. From our standpoint, I think there is a future where home grows might contribute to the commercial market, long as it's regulated, long as it's taxed, long as it's tested. I think they provide a new avenue of bringing your personal produce into the market. Maybe you grow a little bit of green chili at home or a few watermelons. Well, the opportunity, it may seem early now, but and kind of silly in a way, but in the future, that small home grow could contribute to the robustness of New Mexico's cannabis market.
It's interesting. And that kind of you mentioned the idea of a micro grower. One of our members said, do any of these bills build in incentives that would allow or promote small and local growers so that we don't have a powerful monopoly like the tobacco industry come in and take over the New Mexico market?
Ultra Health is the largest producer in the state. And I get concerned when people talk about a monopoly because you should fear a monopoly. But remember, a monopoly is when one dominant producer provider has complete control of the market. There is no monopoly. But I think people, listeners should recognize we're the largest minority owned cannabis company, not just in New Mexico, but in this country. And I think we're a model for what we can do in New Mexico. I think if we take down our boundaries, open up our minds to the possibility of increased competition, increased inclusiveness, I think that these small producers can begin to have a major impact. I think they're going to be the primary engine of where those 11 to 15,000 jobs are going to become from. I think they're going to be the significant area of discovery, letting us learn what strains do best in what parts of the state. So I kind of have a very hopeful feeling that large producers, small producers, individual producers can coexist very successfully in New Mexico.
I just want to make sure I understood what you said. You said Ultra Health is the largest minority-owned cannabis company in the country?
Yes, ma'am. We are very proud of the fact that we are the largest minority cannabis company in the U.S. Also, if you look at our employee base, we're generally much younger. Our average employees generally fall from the age of 21 to about 30, very young, and about 70% of our employees are people of color. So we're very proud of the fact that I think we've become a model of what micros can become in the future. I don't even think Ultra Health has broken its sweat yet as to how big it's going to become, but I think it's not going to be a monopoly. I think it's going to be kind of a beacon in this industry of what the future looks like for a lot of other New Mexicans going forward.
So turning to Ultra Health has a lawsuit right now suing the Department of Health over the limits on the number of plants. And without getting too much, hate to make the pun, but into the weeds, briefly, what's that all about?
Unfortunately, because much of the statutes were not fully defined when it came to medical cannabis legalization itself, a lot of litigation has been pursued to kind of set the rules straight. Plant count is one of them. The Department of Health has always had a very conservative approach about limiting the plants. We tend to believe in a progressive, forward-thinking model. We need to decriminalize the entire view of how we see these plants. There can be control. They should be moderated. They should be measured. They should be tracked from seed to sale. But in that process, we need to produce enough medicine. We need to produce enough plant material. If the market is going to achieve those numbers of 800 million plus, you've got to have product on the shelf. So it's all about making sure there's an ample and adequate supply of medicine and consumable products.
So I want to turn the corner to the agriculture here in New Mexico, because we're a very arid state. We just simply don't have a lot of water. Is this really a good place to grow cannabis?
New Mexico is the 5th largest landmass state in the country. As time goes forward, there's probably going to be 3 large cannabis production areas in the country. California will be a major player. The Great Northwest, Washington, and Oregon likely to emerge as a major player and is preparing itself to be a national, if not international player. I think after that, you have to think about who else is going to be successful in this market. Is it going to be arid and dry Arizona? Is it going to be high elevation Colorado with its extreme cold weathers? Is it going to be Oklahoma? I think it's going to be New Mexico. I think we'll be one of the top growing regions in the entire US. We have ample sunshine, we have great climate, and I think we have adequate and sufficient water supplies. Keep in mind, that cannabis uses about 1/3 the water that most agricultural products consume today. So I think many farmers in New Mexico will look at alternatives to cotton or wheat or even alfalfa. Higher cash crop, lower water, and a greater output for New Mexico.
So do you envision that someday this is going to be a New Mexico brand that gets sold elsewhere?
I think it'll be like salsa. Would you rather get your cannabis from the land of enchantment, where the holistic and healthy environment, the blue skies, the beautiful setting, or do you want it from Pennsylvania, Maryland, and Rhode Island? I don't think we buy our salsa from New York City. I think you will buy your cannabis from Taos, Santa Fe, Las Cruces, and everything that looks and feels like New Mexico.
In the short term, though, we are population-wise, geographically, as you mentioned, we're quite large, but population-wise, we're quite small. So is our market big enough here? And that leads me to, are we trying to lure in people next door to the east?
There's no question that a good number of our consumers will come from the state of Texas. Texas is the second largest population in the US, but I think that's a blessing to New Mexico. The model indicates of the 800 million, approximately 40% will come from out-of-state residents passing through New Mexico. Within 200 miles of the New Mexico-Texas border, there are more adults that can consume than there are in the entire state of New Mexico. So yes, we realistically need to understand they can buy legally in New Mexico and they can consume legally in New Mexico. I think it is a boon to agriculture. I think it'll be a boon to tourism in New Mexico.
And politically, we don't think that this is going to happen anytime soon in Texas.
I think while Texas has been perceived as a sleeping giant, our hope is that it won't be legalized there for a while, but we need to recognize New Mexico needs to step forward and capitalize on this opportunity today. In Texas, they've introduced 13 new bills, including a legalization bill. Who knows how fast they'll move, but I think it's incumbent upon New Mexico to react, to respond, and be ready to serve those patients and those adults very soon.
What happens in local communities here in New Mexico if a local government, I live in the village of Corrales, for example, decides to opt out? Can they do that? Can they keep adult recreational cannabis use out of their towns?
And that's one of the topics that is being debated now. The first version is probably going to be an all-inclusive model. It's very likely to see some debate about counties wanting to have the opt-out, but I think also they need to recognize, though, if you opt out, you're likely to lose out on that tax revenue. You're likely to lose out on those jobs. You're likely to lose out on that economic driver. So while opting out might be a consideration that folks want to see, I think in the first phase of this, it's probably better for the program that we try to make it as inclusive as possible and look at an opt-out possibly in year 2 or 3. But first, folks have got to see the reality before we buy into the fears of what they think it's going to be.
As I said at the beginning, this whole conversation that we're having is not new in New Mexico. It's been going on for quite a while. So in your words, what has changed in 2021?
Very clearly, we've moved away from if, we've moved to now when. And I think more importantly, what has changed is we're now talking about the how. What's it going to look like? How are we going to execute it? It's been very impressive listening to the debate within the legislature this particular year. It's no longer talking about, the scare tactics, the drug on the war, or when I go to Colorado, I smell weed everywhere. It's not that kind of conversation. It's now more of a conversation about, okay, we're going to legalize it. Let's get it right. How much capital are we going to provide for regulatory framework? What's the tax rate going to be? How many dispensaries? How many plants will be produced? How much will consumers be allowed to purchase? It's all about the how. And I think you're having that conversation because of a political outcome this past November. Some of the very staunch conservatives who stopped this debate for many sessions were not reelected. And I think you're now seeing a very progressive, more liberal, more open-minded realization it's going to happen.
I think I would be remiss, or I might be criticized if I didn't ask you one personal question. Do you use cannabis?
I do. I do use cannabis, and I think I'm more representative of a baby boomer user. Um, I don't use it in excess. I think I use it primarily, of course, for its medicinal, but also for the ability to relax and feel better about oneself, interact socially. I tend to argue very strongly that any use of cannabis is a healthy use of cannabis.
And I think just one last question, and probably it's the question on the minds of many New Mexicans, which is what's the timeline? What's the bottom line? When is it that adult New Mexicans will be able to use cannabis for recreational use?
I think our legislature has woken up to the fact that if we're going to do it, we're going to do it sooner than later. We've talked about it, we've debated about it. I think we've had enough conversations that we know what it takes to get it right. The current model proposed is to have sales begin in New Mexico by October 1, 21. Now that might surprise some folks and say, well, that's pretty quick, especially as long as we've waited. We just saw our neighbors to the west in Arizona pass a ballot issue on November 3rd and was selling within 80 days later. It can be done in Arizona, and it certainly can be done in New Mexico. I think we're finally realizing enough talk, enough delay. It's time to get this product and this program successfully launched.
I think we'll be marking our calendars. Is there anything that I've left out, Duke?
I think the last thing I would say is, it's great to have these conversations. It's so impressive to see so many communities rallying around the importance of what it means to every community, not just Albuquerque, Santa Fe, Las Cruces, but everywhere from Lordsburg to Clayton, from Jal to Farmington. That's something we haven't seen in the past, and I think everyone is taking it in a very responsible, respectful debate. And that's a positive we haven't seen on this issue in many years.
Well, I thank you for taking the time to talk with us about it. And thanks to James McGrath Morris and Ann Hillerman, who helped to set up the interview and record it. And thanks to all of you who are watching.